I'm Dr. Meagan Grega, and I'm a Lehigh Valley native, and I'm also the co-founder and chief medical officer of Kellen Foundation. What's most important to me is to help nurture and support health and longevity and vitality throughout the Lehigh Valley and also through the country and the world. Today I'm going to be talking about epigenetics and how to play to win with the hand that you're dealt. I'm a doctor. I'm board certified in lifestyle medicine and in family medicine. I'm a leader. I'm the leader of the nonprofit organization here in the Lehigh Valley with my wonderful co-founder, Eric Ruth, that is called Kellen Foundation. I am a teacher. I teach medical students and residents, and I have to say, you guys, you warm my heart. The fact that so many of you are here in the audience today, I really appreciate that you gave up a Saturday in training or in medical school to come hang out with all of us. I'm a volunteer. I'm on the board of directors for the American College of Lifestyle Medicine and the American Board of Lifestyle Medicine. And I'm also a mom and a grandmom, so you're gonna get to see, maybe, my awesome twin grandbabies around here somewhere later today, so I'm excited about that. Start them early. All right, and I think really though, one of the most important things that I am is I'm a believer. And I'm a believer in the power of our lifestyle choices and the strength of our social connections to really shape our health and our longevity destiny. So I'm so excited to have all of you guys here today so we can engage in this dialogue about how we can live our best life. Or, as another way to put it, how we can play to win with the cards we were dealt. So let me grab the clicker here and we'll get started on epigenetics. So, whoops, see, this is happening already, John. Okay, I'm good. Okay, so we'll start with our learning objectives, which is we're going to just describe the effect of epigenetic changes on the risk for chronic disease and what sort of lifestyle habits result in positive changes that will decrease our risk of chronic disease. And I have nothing to disclose about financial conflicts or anything like that. Okay, now. Could you move that for me, John? That would be awesome. Cool. All right, so before we get into epigenetics, let's talk about DNA. And so let's talk about, does DNA define our destiny? And we're going to do this first question kind of like we do in the elementary schools when we're talking about healthy lifestyles. We ask the kids to answer questions. So everybody put your fist out like this. This is the tactile kinesthetic part. Good? Okay. Now, if you think that yes, DNA defines our destiny, put the thumbs up. If you think no, it does not define our destiny, thumbs down. And if you're like, I don't know, kind of complicated, you can put it in the middle. That's cool. All right, good. So we have an interesting range here. Awesome. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So let's talk about, what is this whole DNA stuff? Too far. Okay. Did you do? John and I are now fighting over the computer. Okay, cool. So let's start with our friend Gregor Mendel and the peas, okay? So Gregor Mendel is considered the father of genetics. He's the guy that I learned about in elementary school, and I got all excited, and I came home to my parents, and I was like, I love science. I want to create things out of genes. And they were like, whoa, what are you doing in your bedroom when you're having, like, you say you're, like, doing experiments? What's going on? Because soon after that, I actually read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and they were, like, really, getting concerned. So let's get back to Gregor Mendel, though. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk. And he was hanging around in the 1950s in his garden, in his monastery, and he was trying to figure out how in the world do things get passed down from parent to offspring? Because back at that point, it was thought that it was like this kind of dilution. Like, you took your red and you took your blue and you ended up with purple, and it was all just this like kind of smooshing together. But then he couldn't understand, like, why do you get sometimes these green peas or these yellow peas or these wrinkly peas or these smooth peas? Like, that's not a dilution together. What's going on? And he was able to figure out that actually there are dominant traits and there are recessive traits. Now, this is not surprising to us now, but back in the 1850s, like, this was pretty cutting edge stuff to say. It wasn't all just mixing together. We got our dominant traits, we got our recessive traits. He also figured out by these P crosses that he did that different traits could go down the generations separately. So that's, they were independent. So you could end up being a green pea that was wrinkly. You could end up being a yellow pea that was smooth. Like, there was all these different things they could do together. And when he looked at between dominant and recessive, he was able to say, okay, let's say green is dominant for peas and yellow is a recessive for peas. You mix the two together up there at the top, the parents. all the first generation is going to be green because of the dominant color. And you'd be like, oh, okay, so I guess we're getting green peas from now on. No. If you mix the second generation, that's F1, together, you end up with 25% of the next generation's peas, or 25% of them are going to be yellow. I mean, like, this was like magic at that point. I don't know, you can just sort of imagine Gregor Mendel hanging out with his monastery buddies and like talking about all this. And I don't know if they thought he was crazy or if they thought he was like the life of the garden club because he could magically make yellow peas. Like, what was going on? But he actually published about this in the 1860s, and that's when we started to hear, or really the science or the history of actual modern genetics began at that time when he published. Okay. So then things kind of hung out. People were breeding different stuff, trying to figure out what was going on with these traits, because nobody really knew what was the mechanism. They knew that there were these traits that they could look at, but they didn't know how did it get passed from the parents to the offspring. So that gets us to Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin. We don't get to hear about her enough, but Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin are the ones that did the research that showed us the DNA structure. And now, all of a sudden, we had this roadmap, right? And we kind of thought, at least back in the 1950s when this was published, we kind of thought, okay, this is the blueprint, right? This is how you know when you're born, you got this roadmap, and that's what decides your health and your longevity. And people were kind of looking at it like a railroad track, right? You're born, we put you on the track. This is your genes. Good luck, because it's going wherever you're going, like you're stuck, you're on that track. And that's how it was thought about for a while. And I mean, it's definitely true that traits are passed down from parent to child. I mean, my hazel eyes are a mixture of my mom's chocolate brown eyes and my dad's light blue eyes, and you know, that was passed down. My ancestry is Welsh, and if you ever go to Wales, you will see a ton of women walking around that look almost exactly like me, like my same shape, my same skin tone, same kind of basic features. So it's definitely true that we pass things down. Your genes do make some decisions, there's no doubt. So genes run in families, traits run in families, but is that the whole story? And you'll hear still that there's some misperceptions about that because people say, like, well, you know, my mom had the same health issue, it's in my genes. It's almost like saying, ugh, there's like nothing I could do about it. Or, you know, it runs in my family, I knew I was gonna get this eventually, you know, no matter, it's just a matter of time. Or, you know, it's just bad luck, it's in my genes. And it's kind of like people give up in a way, or they say like, ugh, you know, it just stinks, I got these bad genes, there's nothing I can do about it. And like we said, genes do pass down in families, and there are some things that are definitely dominant, you know, and if you have the gene, you're gonna get the thing, that's definitely true. But most things, as far as what our genes are concerned, are really kind of more like suggestions. They're like a committee that's saying like, well, we might go this way, or we might go that way. So let's think about what else runs in families. There's our genes. But just shout out just what's something we do. What else do we teach in our families? Anything? Culture? Yep, culture. Actually, that brings me to Dr. Katz, one of my good friends and colleagues, Dr. David Katz, who always says, lifestyle may be the medicine, but culture is the spoon. It's basically your culture makes such a difference. And that impacts things like, whoa, what have I done to this? Okay, so that impacts things like your food choices. What do you like to eat? What is typical in your family? How do you handle stress? You know, do you have healthy stress management strategies, or do you like bottle it all up inside until you explode? How about attitudes towards rest and recovery? I mean, I was very, very fortunate. I came from a very type A family, which has gotten me very far in life, you know, but it also sometimes means that, actually, in my high school yearbook, Easton Area High School, my quote was from Pink Floyd. At age 18, no, actually at age 16, because I graduated at 16. So at age 16, I said, it is better to burn out than to fade away. Like medicine? I mean, I apparently was being very prescient about this is the path I'm going on. So our families teach us how do we, you know, do rest and recovery, okay? Are we sedentary versus active? When we get together, do we sit down and watch TV, or do we get up and go for a hike? You know, that's a big thing. How about our environmental exposures? And that we have less control over, but you know, where our family lived, where we grow up, you know, all of those things make a big difference too. So do tobacco and alcohol use. So how common is it in your family, or how normative is it in your family to smoke, or how much alcohol? And then ways of dealing with anger. That's another huge one. That goes to our social connection and nurturing of positive relationships, but also our stress. And then things like focusing on those relationships. Do we make time for them? Do we prioritize them? So we're going to talk about all those sorts of things. But those things run in families just as strongly as our genes do. And that's where the epigenetic levers can be kind of worked with, is on our lifestyle behaviors like that. Because we actually don't just inherit DNA. We think so. We're like, it's DNA, those are the genes, that's what happens. No, we get chromosomes. So chromosomes are not naked strands of DNA that are just kind of hanging out there in the cell. About 50% of it is DNA, and the other 50% is the proteins that make the structure of the chromosomes and kind of hold the chromosomes together. That's where we see the effect of a lot of those sort of epigenetic levers that can change what DNA or what genes are being read and expressed, and which ones are quiet and you never actually hear about them. Oops, that's too far. So, we probably should have realized that it wasn't just about the genes, right? Because all of us, every cell in your body, all of us have the same genes in every cell of our body. We don't have the same genes together, but like when we're born, every cell has the same genes, same DNA. You know, some mutations may happen later as we get older, but the same DNA is in every cell, and then those cells go on to make tons of different tissues. So like these are skin cells, same DNA, eyes, same DNA, bones, and all that other stuff now that it all came up on the screen, you know, why not? So same DNA makes all these different structures. How is that possible? Like, who's driving the bus here? How do you figure out? Are you going to be a liver? Are you going to be an eye? Are you going to be an ear? What's going on? It is those epigenetic levers, those proteins. Which ones of our genes are being read, and which ones of our genes are being shut off or not read? And that's critical, because you do not want a liver cell coming out of your ear. You know, like that would be horrible. So our body knows how to do this already. It's like a light switch. So if you think about our genes, they're like the Library of Congress. They have got all the information. They have so much stuff. But not everything's being read all the time. Some stuff hasn't been read for years. You know, it's like nobody's reading it. So it ends up being that you can change what genes are being expressed within a certain extent based on these light switches that are like epigenetic levers, turning some genes on, turning other genes off. And you can shift the balance of the good things, the healthy things, the things that are going to promote your longevity away from the things that are like the less healthy kind of disease-promoting genes. And it turns out that actually only about a third of the variation in human lifespan, like how long we live, only about a third is genetically determined at birth. And they know this from studies with twins. The rest of it all has to do with our lifestyle exposures, the way we choose to live. So like that's 2/3. Yeah, a lot of room to work with there, right? I mean, a third, yeah, that's a problem. But it'd be great if we could all pick perfect parents. That'd be fabulous. But even if we have a lot of disease genes in our family, we still have like 2/3 of a chance, or at least an impact, to be able to make changes. So I think that's one of the most inspiring and kind of like empowering things that we can talk to our patients and our families and ourselves, our friends, everybody, is to be like, DNA is not your destiny. It's really more about what you choose to do with every day. Okay, so it's more like this. You know, I showed you the train track in the beginning, like you're born and there you go. It's really more like this. I mean, yes, we've got a path. Our DNA gives us a path. But we have a lot of choices and options and ways that we can navigate that life path that can end up putting us in a much happier, healthier, more vital sort of a place. Okay, so that's cool. But how do you do that? Like, what turns your genes on? What turns your genes off? I mean, this is great. So what happens? Okay, so first we're going to say biologically. Biologically, what happens is there's this stuff called DNA methylation. So that's actually going on your DNA. You stick a methyl group on, and that seems to turn genes off, okay? You don't need to know all the biochemistry. Just know DNA methylation typically turns stuff off. All right. Then there's histone acetylation, and histones are the proteins. They're like little teeny, almost like BBs or marbles, that the DNA is wrapped around. And with histones, when they get acetylated, they get an acetyl group put on it, that relaxes them, and then the DNA sort of opens up, and it makes it easier for you to be able to express those genes. So histone acetylation turns genes on, typically. And then there's these things called microRNAs and small interfering RNAs that I think of as like little Velcro things that are going around in the cell and finding the other RNA, which is going to turn into the protein, like the RNA is going to tell the body how to make that protein. They find it and go, oh, that's a match, and they stick together and get rid of it. So you can think of microRNAs and small interfering RNAs as Velcro that basically turn stuff off. So we've got a couple of different ways that we can do that. That's biologically, but what about like your life? What does that stuff? What puts things on, what methylates things or opens things up? Well, it's really our lifestyle exposures. It's what we eat. It's how much are we moving around during the day? How much are we sleeping? Do we have a lot of stress? Do we have supported relationships, environmental toxins? Like all of those things are what's deciding what light switches are turned on and what light switches are turned off. I'm going to be giving kind of an overview of a few things, but luckily today we've got these phenomenal speakers that are all going to be hitting on different pieces of this so you can get a deeper dive onto how we can turn our genes on and off in the way that we'd like. Too far. Can you go back, little John? If we can go back to somebody who looks like a grandfather. Yes, perfect. Okay. So centenarians, if you look at centenarians and look at their methylation age, like you take the blood and you look and see what sort of epigenetic levers are going on, they actually are 8.6 years on average, years younger than you would think based on their chronological age. So their biological age is aging slower than their chronological age. So we know that this stuff has real impacts in real life, not just like in our chemistry set or on our cell culture dish. Okay. Now, it's not just humans. Actually, there's some very, very great evidence about maybe that we should have thought of this before, because look at some of the things that happen in nature. These are bees. And when you think about bees, the one that has the number on the top is not the quarterback. That is the queen. That is their queen bee. And queen bees and worker bees have identical genomes. They are sisters, and they have identical DNA. The only difference is that the queen bee was fed the royal jelly as a larva, and the worker bees were not. And what happens when she was fed the royal jelly is she gets bigger, her wings get smaller because she's not going to need them, she's not going out flying around or anything, and she lives a lot longer. So worker bees, who are the sisters that are the same DNA, same genetics, they go out and they do stuff for the hive and all sorts of different things. They usually live 1 to 2 months, maybe a little longer in the wintertime. Whereas the queen bee lives for years and just is making, laying eggs all the time. Same genes, different food at a very critical point of their development ends up with a very different lifespan. All right. These caterpillars are another really great example of it. All right, so these are caterpillars that have 2 different broods that come out. One comes in the spring, one comes in the summer. And when you look at these caterpillars, you'd say, actually, I don't know if you guys can even see the caterpillars. Look at this. That's one. So that's the spring brood. And the spring brood basically eats the catkins, which are these other things. Those are not more caterpillars. Those are just like part of the plant or out of the tree. So those caterpillars eat the things that look exactly like it. And it turns those caterpillars into that shape, which is perfect camouflage for that time of year and means that they are much more likely to survive. So it's what they eat as caterpillar larvae. Then later in the summer, they look like that. So they look like a twig because they're eating the leaves, the catkins, those things that are like fluffy looking, they're all gone by then. So they eat the leaves. The same genes turns into that type of caterpillar just based on what they're eating. Okay, so who are my Generation X crew here? Got some? All right, anybody remember what that is? It's a gremlin, right? And so actually, as it turns out, gremlins have epigenetics too. Does anybody remember the 3 things you do not do with a gremlin? No bright light, don't get them wet, and do not feed them after midnight. Yeah. You'll get this. So, see, even our 1980s filmmakers, they understood epigenetics, right? All right, so now going back into the real world, let's talk about agouti mice, because agouti mice are another example of turning genes on and off based on what you eat. So the agouti gene, when it is turned on, when it's being expressed, ends up having a mouse that is yellow, overweight or obese, more likely to have diabetes, more likely to get cancer. So these two mice right here are genetically identical, and they are the same age, even though they look very different. The agouti one, the yellow one, has an unmethylated agouti gene. Remember, methyl groups turn things off. So the gene is on, and that is what the phenotype or the look of that agouti mice is. It's yellow, more likely to be sick, more likely to die early. Now, the brown mouse is methylated. So it's still the same agouti gene. It has it. The agouti gene's there. But there's a methyl group on it, and that means it ends up with a brown coat. It's lean. It has a normal lifespan, unlikely to be getting sick. Well, okay, but how does that happen? Well, they took actually pregnant yellow mice, the ones that had the agouti gene on. They fed those pregnant mice a bunch of methyl type containing foods. We'll talk about what that is, but there are lots and lots of methyl groups in the diet. And their babies, their offspring, turned out to be brown mice. So even though it was in utero, they were able to turn off the agouti gene. Even though the mom's agouti gene was on, babies' agouti genes were off, and they ended up having normal lifespan, be brown coat, normal weight. So this is happening in mammals, just like in the insect kingdom as well. And it's really what I've told you so far, at least, is about what you eat. So plants are your epigenetic pharmacy. And that's, where do you get those methyl groups? B vitamins, folate, so fruits and vegetables and whole grains and beans, right? All nuts and seeds, all the good stuff. That puts more methyl groups into your body. Now, there's a lot of other things it does too, fiber. We're going to have some other great talks about whole food plant-based or plant-predominant nutrition. But what you eat, and primarily plants, are an epigenetic pharmacy that can turn off inflammation, turn down reactive oxygen species, help your body repair DNA damage. So that is where you can find the lever to turn on and off the genes that you're thinking about as far as things like diabetes or cancer or heart disease. So speaking of cancer, this is our friend Dean Ornish. Dean Ornish has, this guy is a visionary. He has been working on lifestyle medicine stuff for decades. I don't mean 4 decades, I mean like four decades. And he has done work in cardiovascular disease and cancer and cognition. This is one of his cancer studies that he did on prostate cancer. So basically, now we went from bugs and insects to mice. Now we're moving into men. We're moving into people. And this is a group of men who were diagnosed with early stage prostate cancer. So they were in that they could choose to have therapy, or they could go into the kind of watchful waiting. And what they did is they randomized them. So this is key, because a lot of lifestyle medicine stuff is not always randomized. But this is a randomized clinical trial. Took half the guys and said, do what you do, we're watchful waiting, we'll just keep an eye on you. The other half, they said, okay, we're going to put you in this intensive therapeutic lifestyle change program. We're going to teach you how to eat a low-fat, whole food, plant-predominant diet. We're going to do physical activity together. We're going to do stress management stuff together. We're going to have a social support network. We're going to have group visits and social support, all that good stuff. If you can bring in a family member, that's great. And they did that for a year and then said, okay, what happened with their prostate cancer? For the group that was in the intensive lifestyle change, 0 of those people actually needed to go on to more definitive conventional treatment like prostatectomy or radiation therapy, and their PSA on average decreased about 4%. Versus the control group, 6 needed to actually go on to conventional therapy because of worsening of their disease, and their PSA in general on average increased about 6%. They also did a cool part of this study where they said, okay, we're going to take the serum, the kind of like clear part of your blood, and we'll take that from the people who are in the control group and the people who are in the intervention group, and we're going to drip it on prostate cancer cells in cell culture, see what happens. And what they found is that for the participants who were part of the intensive therapeutic lifestyle change group, they actually were able to inhibit the growth of the prostate cell cancers in that cell culture 8 times more than the people who were just kind of doing their normal day-to-day life stuff. So basically, when you're doing this intensive lifestyle change program that Dean Ornish was saying, your body becomes this amazing cancer-killing machine. It's like your blood is going everywhere and finding the cancer cells and hopefully extinguishing a chunk of them. So he said, okay, that's cool. That was a year. That's interesting. I wonder why we see this. Why are people not getting worse? Why is their PSA going down? What's up? What's happening with their genes? And so what he did is he took another group. This time it was only 30 guys, and it was for only 30 months. I'm sorry, 3 months. Not 30 months, 30 guys, 3 months. And what he did, basically, they acted as their own controls this time. So they did a biopsy of the prostate pre-intervention, biopsy post-intervention, did the same lifestyle change program, and said, what happens to the genes? And what they found was in just 3 months, over 400 genes that are known to be associated with cancer were turned off or down. And almost 50 that were known to be associated with cancer treatment or prevention were turned up and on. And actually also telomerase activity, which is what rebuilds the ends of your chromosomes, so your telomeres are getting rebuilt, that went up in these guys too. So this just goes to show how quickly lifestyle changes turn your genes on and off, and what you can see as far as something like a disease like cancer. So cancer is a pretty scary word. We don't like cancer. But dementia is a pretty scary word too. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of treatments that we have that are really effective for dementia. And so one of the things we try to do is prevent dementia, and that's what this particular study looked at. And they didn't actually do an intervention. What this was a retrospective cohort trial of a very, very large data set called the UK Biobank. And what they looked at is they took the people and they made what's called a polygenic risk score. So there's genes, there's loci, like places on the chromosomes, where we know that if you have a certain one of those genes that you are more likely to get dementia. There's a lot of them. A lot of people hear about the APOE4 gene, there's that, but there's a whole bunch of them. And so what they did is they looked at everybody's genome and said, okay, how many of these high-risk genes do you have? And they made a composite polygenic risk score, and they broke the group into quintiles. So the highest quintile was the people who had the most of those kind of like concerning or risk-promoting genes. The lowest quintile was the group that had the least, and then they had the intermediate, which was like in the middle. And they also looked at their healthy lifestyle habits, and it was pretty simple. They were just looking at how much physical activity, whether they smoked, what their alcohol use was like, and they had this thing that they called healthy diet. And healthy diet, when I kind of dove into what is healthy diet, because that could be all sorts of different things. It was a pretty low bar. So the low bar was if they were consistently with food frequency questionnaires saying that they were eating 4 out of the 7, recommended categories of foods like fruits and vegetables and things. So not the same as what Dean Ornish was doing, but still, you're able to get a lifestyle score. So people who were considered having a healthy lifestyle had at least positive things for 3 or 4 of those lifestyle habits. If they had an unhealthy lifestyle, they had 0 to 1, and intermediate was 2. Okay, so they looked at these people and said, we know they don't have dementia yet. That's the key. None of these people had dementia at the beginning, and they looked at them over time to say what happens to their cognitive capacity. And probably not surprisingly, people who had high genetic risk and unhealthy lifestyles, they were at almost 3 times the risk of developing dementia versus people who had low genetic risk and healthy lifestyles. So obviously, great if so the people who had high genetic risk and unhealthy lifestyles, that's 2 strikes right there. You already got your 2 strikes. Whereas the people that had low genetic risk and had a healthy lifestyle, they had no strikes. So you're going to end up with a different outcome. But I think this was the most important part, which was people who had the high genetic risk and healthy lifestyles had a 30% decreased risk of getting demented compared to their other compatriots who had high genetic risk and unhealthy lifestyle. So the lifestyle made a difference. It made a significant difference. People who have a high genetic risk for dementia, that's being dealt a bad hand. You got some bad cards. But you can actually play in such a way so that you minimize that damage. Is it as good as the people that don't have the genetic risk and have a healthy lifestyle? No, I mean, it would be great if we could all not have high genetic risk. But again, it is that DNA is not our destiny, because people who had a high genetic risk were able to modify the likelihood of dementia. And remember, this is the thing. When I looked at this study, and I understand it's a retrospective kind of cohort study, they weren't trying to tell people what to do, but I would have loved to see what would have been the effect if people were truly eating a very healthy life or a healthy diet, and we're actually focusing on sleep, because that wasn't a part of this, and had a supportive social connection. There's so many other pieces that could go with this, but that's not what the data is in this study. So we take what we can get, and I look at this as a positive that no matter what your genes say, and most of us don't know what our genes say. Most of us don't have a polygenic risk score. But no matter what, you're going to end up better off if you focus on the healthy lifestyle piece. All right, so that's people that didn't have dementia yet. What about people that do? This just came out. This is a really recent study from Dean Ornish. Small, but randomized control. So kind of like, I think of it almost as a pilot study. And what he did is he took people who already had mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease diagnoses, all right? And he put them through a intensive multi-domain lifestyle intervention. So same thing that he did with the prostate cancer, same thing that he had done with cardiovascular disease before that I'm not talking about today, but solve reversal of cardiovascular disease. Same sort of thing, focus on food, movement, decreased stress, social connection. And what happened? Well, they also assessed these people at the beginning with standardized cognitive and function tests, the same type of tests that we use when we're looking at a pharmaceutical treatment for dementia. So standardized test, and then they also evaluated biomarkers, like these ones up here, some of them have to do with like, are you likely to be having Alzheimer's disease? That's the alpha-beta 42-40 ratio. They also looked at microbiome, they looked at telomere length, and they looked at all that stuff and then said, okay, what happens between the control group, because the control group was put on a wait list. They said, okay, you have to hold on, we're gonna do this and then you'll get to be part of the group too. And after just 20 weeks, this study's supposed to go for 40 weeks, but after just 20 weeks, they gave the initial report out. And after just 20 weeks, they found that the people who were part of the intervention group had significant differences compared to the control group, both in their actual testing of cognition and function, and also in their biomarkers. Did everybody get better? No, I wish. I mean, because this is one of the things that I wish we had a magic bullet for Alzheimer's or for dementia. But 70% of the intervention group either stayed stable, didn't get worse, or got better. There's almost nothing in the literature that people get better once they already have cognitive decline. Now, what about the control group? Well, did anybody get better? No. And 70% either worsened significantly or a lot. So that doesn't mean that everybody worsened again. So again, there's all these different pieces that play into this. It's not a yes or no. But they found that the dose-response correlation between the degree of lifestyle change that people made was very strongly correlated to how much they either improved or stayed stable. So the more you put into it, the more likelihood that you're going to be able to improve or at least stabilize. And even stabilizing with dementia is something that we think of as very, very important. So again, small study. I am hoping that, I'm looking forward to the results at 40 weeks. That'll be cool. I'm also hoping that somebody does a bigger study and replicates the results. This is how we move forward in science, is we keep checking on these things. But this is the most hopeful thing I've seen in dementia, I think, in my career. And I've been looking at this ever since I was in medical school, because I have a lot of Alzheimer's disease in my family. And so I started looking at this very early, and I've never seen people get better. Now, there might be some studies out there, you guys may know of some, but let's hope that this continues to be what we find in this type of a intervention. Now, you guys might be like, why do you have this bagpiper here? You're talking about dementia. What's going on? So any of you guys are here from Bethlehem, you know that Liberty High School has a bagpipe part of their band, the Grenadiers, and they are amazing, but that's not why I have it there. I have it there because we don't have time today to watch this video from nutritionfacts.org. I put the code up if you guys want to look at it. You could also just look up Dr. Grega and Alzheimer's testimonial. You could do that. I'm going to be sending these links to you guys as far as the actual, presentations that we do, or at least the videos of them. But what this video talks about is testimonials from some people who improved on the actual 20 weeks. And one of the guys was a bagpiper, and that was part of what his we're going to talk about Ikigai later, but that was part of what his passion was. It's part of who he was as his identity, and his dementia basically removed his ability to be able to play his bagpipes. He couldn't march in the parades anymore. He couldn't remember the notes. He couldn't remember the songs. And so that was a really sad, depressing thing for him. And he was one of the people in the 20 weeks where he got better enough that he can now play his bagpipes again. He said that he could do 8 songs straight through without stopping, and he had not been able to do that for years. So I think that, there's facts. As scientists, as doctors, we love to tell you guys the hazard ratio and the sensitivity and what was the p-value, and that's important because we want to make sure that our science is solid. But I think stories really tell even a better, kind of stories tell a story, right? Like they actually give you a feeling of what happens, and that's why I like this video. So for anybody who's interested, you can take a look at it, and that's why I put the bagpiper there, because I thought how amazing that this guy was able to, which looks very complicated to me. trying to be a bagpiper, I think, is probably very complicated, and he was able to regain that. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about food and different things as far as what people are eating, but stress. Stress has another big effect on our brains. So this is the atherosclerosis risk and community study, big study that looked at bunches of different things, but part of what they looked at was middle-aged people, so me, and I wasn't in the study, but basically people like me, and looked at what their inflammatory markers were at midlife. So they looked at things like high sensitivity CRP, fibrinogen, all these different things that we know of are a sign of inflammation. And they followed them for 24 years to see what would happen with their brain. And what they found is that for the people who had high inflammation at midlife, and lots of things can cause inflammation. It can be stress, it can be lack of sleep, it can be being sedentary, what you eat, all sorts of things. But if you have a lot of inflammation in your body at midlife, what they found was that in older years, so in their 70s, they had smaller brains, like their actual brain regions from things like your occipital region and Alzheimer's disease region, and all those places had shrunk, and the ventricles had grown, so basically had enlarged. So they basically had smaller brains, and their ability to have like word recall and episodic memory had decreased. The reason I bring this up is because so many of us say like, well, when I retire, that's when I'll have time to really focus on my health. I'll relax more, and I'll be able to be physically active, and I just got to kind of grind it out in my early years and my middle years, and then Don't wait, because what's happening to our brains while we are undergoing that stress is going to make it less likely that you're going to be able to enjoy all the things that you want to do as you get older. So it's kind of like a smoldering fire that's going on, and stress reduction can make a big difference. And there's lots of ways that we can do that as far as decreasing inflammation. So what about epigenetic effects with our cardiometabolic health? There's a ton of studies. I'm just going to go through it real quick, a couple of them, which is one is that exercise increases the methylation. Remember, methylation turns things off of the P66 gene, so that decreases oxidative stress. Cool. There was another study that said 6 months of exercise training changes the methylation of gene regions that affect things about type 2 diabetes and obesity. So again, turning things off, calming things down, making it, if you have a disease that makes, or not a disease, I'm sorry, a gene that predisposes you to diabetes or obesity, kind of calming that down, turning that off. And then eating the Mediterranean diet has shown that they get those little microRNAs. Remember that Velcro that I said goes around and goes, oop, that's not going to be actually translated into a protein. That they found is associated with decreased reactive oxygen species and also pro-inflammatory mediators, so it turns down inflammation and oxidation, but it actually turns up, improves mediators that have to do with endothelial function, so your heart and everything can, and all of your organs can get better blood. So epigenetics is happening in our bodies all the time based on what we choose to eat, what physical activity we're doing, and all these other lifestyle factors. All right, so what about sleep? Oh, I think if we all had, well, actually a lot of us are physicians here or healthcare professionals, but I think almost for everybody now in this day and age, sleep is one of our lifestyle factors that is the hardest to really, focus on. Now that we have light bulbs and Netflix and, social media and everything, but it's amazingly impactful quickly what happens when you have sleep deprivation. So this study, they took healthy people and they used them as their own controls. It was a crossover study. And for 1 week, they forced them to have less than 6 hours of sleep a night for the whole week. They had them in a sleep lab. They woke them up. They didn't let them sleep. For the other week, they were allowed to sleep as long as they wanted to. And most of them ended up sleeping around 8.5 hours a night when that was the case. And they were able to, have sufficient sleep. During that time, they compared their transcriptome, which is basically what genes are turned on, what genes are turned off. And in just 1 week of sleep deprivation, they saw a difference in the function of 711 genes in just that 1 week. And a lot of them had to do with circadian rhythm, metabolism, inflammation, immunity, and oxidative stress. So sleep deprivation quickly ratchets up that type of a change in our genome and our epigenetics of what our body's doing. Oops, too far. Can you go back? Thank you. Oh, too far again. One more forward. Thank you. Okay. All right, so social connection. We'll talk about that real quick. This is not something I learned about in medical school at all, like what was going on as far as our relationships. But we have found that the power of our social relationships, our connections, are one of the most powerful kind of longevity boosters that we have. So there's the study of adult development, the Harvard study of adult development. I definitely recommend Dr. Robert Waldinger, who's the current executive director of that study, his book, The Good Life, or his TED Talk, either one, they're both great. But what they found by following a group of men from Harvard and then eventually their wives and their children and a kind of control group or a comparison group of men from Boston who were kind of from the lower socioeconomic, did not get the same educational attainment sort of groups, and they found that over time, over your life, what really makes a difference is more your strength of your relationships. That's what adds to longevity, but also to happiness and vitality. As long as you have your basic needs met, you have your house, you have your food, you feel safe. Once you get to that, more power, wealth, status, that does not seem to make a difference. It's really how much are you leaning into your relationships? Who do you have that supports you? Do you feel safe? Do you feel like you have somebody you could lean on? That makes a huge difference. There's another study that is part of the health and retirement study that looked at older adults, and they asked them just 3 questions. They said, do you feel isolated? Do you feel left out? Do you feel like you have lack of companionship? And if they said yes to any of those 3, they were classified as lonely. And then they followed the people over a course of time and found that the people who were classified as lonely were more likely to have problems with their activities of daily living, like that, their capacity decreased, but they're also 60% more likely to die during the 8-year study period with the loneliness, even after you take care of or look at confounding sort of factors, you adjust for that. So I always think of loneliness as a modifiable risk factor. That is something that we want to try and work on our blood pressure, right? We want to try and keep our cholesterol good. We should also be really working on our relationships. So an example of that is the Rosetto effect. Anybody here know Rosetto? Yeah, right? That's just up the road here in the Lehigh Valley. We had this phenomenal place. Well, we still have the phenomenal place called Rosetto, but we had this really fascinating thing happen just up the road in the early 1900s. And it was the Rosetto effect is basically the surprising finding that the men and women of Rosetto, which was a small Italian-American community up kind of close to Bangor, had phenomenally low rates of myocardial infarction compared to their neighbors in Bangor and in Nazareth, who had very similar access to health care, very similar environments, similar working sort of situations, even similar cardiac risk factors. And people were trying to figure out, what's that about? Why did that happen? So what you see here is Rosetto, but also Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which is the church that's up there in Rosetto. And they had a church school, a lot of things focused on that. This is the Ruggiero family, and they were similar to many families in Rosetto in that all of the brothers, sisters, cousins, everybody lived into their 80s or 90s, except for this gentleman, Carmen, who actually lived to almost 104. That was at his 100th birthday, but he lived to almost 104. And so what was going on in Rosetto? Well, Rosetto is, like I said, close-knit, small Italian-American community. They had a lot of 3-generation households. They also had a real family-centered social life. People were rarely feeling isolated or alone, no matter how old or how young they were. They had strong religious connection, and they also had a strong support of the community. Like it was considered a badge of honor to buy at the local businesses and work with your neighbors to do things. They had a lot of civic-minded kind of participation in volunteering or community events. There actually was a carnival up there for a long time that was almost the entire town would come out for. And they had really strong social cohesion, feeling like they belonged. They did in the early 1900s, up until about the 1960s. Around that time, in the 1960s and beyond, the younger generations in Rosetto kind of were like, I kind of want to live the way everybody else in the Lehigh Valley is living, and they sort of changed those habits. And we see a similar change in what happened as far as their myocardial infarction rates. But realize that the Rosetto group, they weren't doing everything they would not have passed Dean Ornish's program by any means, because they also had a lot of other things that maybe were not the best as far as their health. They had plentiful homemade red wine, so there was a whole lot of that, but homemade red wine, okay. Smoking was common, and that is just as common as it was in Bangor and Nazareth at that point. They did make a lot of their food at home, but it was often prepared with lard and salt and things like that. I am not telling you to eat like this and try to do the Rosetto effect. I'm just trying to say social connection and the strength of your community can make a massive difference. They did also enjoy sweet desserts, things like that. So it's not like they were these superhuman, amazing, like only eating plants and walking everywhere and sleeping all the time people. But they did see a really, really strong connection with their family and their community. So what happened? Here's their myocardial infarction rates, and compared to Bangor. So Rosetto and Bangor are right next to each other. These are adjusted based on the population sizes, so they are basically comparing apples to apples. And what you can see is in the early 1930s all the way up until like the mid-1960s, the heart attack rates in Rosetto were anywhere from 40% to 30% less than what was happening in the neighboring town of Bangor. But after we get into the 1960s and beyond, the complete cardioprotective effect of that environment had pretty much disappeared. So that's epigenetics really kind of happening in real time, right in front of our eyes, just up the road. So I'm going to start wrapping things up here a little bit. The other thing that's really important is the importance of Ikigai. And the reason I put a picture of veg stock up there is because Kellen Foundation is my Ikigai. And that is like, what is your purpose? So has anybody heard the term Ikigai before? I would imagine a lot of you guys here have. Yep. So Ikigai is a Confucian phrase, comes from the Okinawan Blue Zone, and it means, why do you get up in the morning? Like, what are you passionate about? What fires you? And having an Ikigai, being able to identify something that fires you, that you're passionate about, is critically important as far as your longevity, your health, your vitality, and your happiness. So studies have shown that people who have a sense of purpose, they live longer than those that don't, they are healthier, they are less likely to have heart attacks or die prematurely, and volunteering is a great Ikigai. And that actually, people who are volunteers, they score higher in being like happy with their life, less pain, less depression. So a lot of times we're all busy, right? Everybody's like so busy trying to get their work done, trying to get the kids here, or go take your parents there or whatever, that we don't give space for the things that makes our life sing or gives us joy. And we would say, oh, I better take my blood pressure medicine, or I better make sure I get my steps in. I agree, don't stop doing those things. But give yourself time. Give yourself permission for your Ikigai, the things that you're passionate about, because it is just as important as far as your length of life, and especially, even more so, how happy those years are. So the American Heart Association kind of goes along with all this. I mean, we've been talking about the lifestyle medicine version of things, but the American Heart Association agrees in general. They called it the Simple Seven. And they basically said, if you don't smoke and you eat a healthy diet, we can always talk about what a healthy diet is, but that's what they were talking about. If you're physically active, you maintain a healthy weight, you manage your blood pressure even with medication, control your cholesterol even with medication, and reduce your blood sugar even with medication if you need to. If you can do just 4 of those things, you have a 50% decreased risk of dying of heart attack compared to the general population, basically. So at least for people that don't do any of those things. So just 4 of those things can cut your risk of having a heart attack in half. Pretty impressive. But only 1% of Americans have ideal numbers for all 7 of those factors. And then just a couple years ago actually, the American Heart Association, I think, got on the bandwagon about sleep, and they made it the Essential 8. So it used to be the Simple 7, now it's the Essential 8. And the Essential 8 is what basically adds getting enough sleep, rejuvenating, restorative sleep. So I gotta say, if only 1% of Americans had the Simple 7 all checked off, I'm thinking we're even lower as far as where the sleep is concerned. All right, so we've talked about a lot of good stuff, right? But does this actually, how does this play out in the real world? How does this epigenetic stuff work? Well, there was a study that looked at the Framingham Heart Study participants that tried to quantify with that life's essential 8. How does that play with your epigenetics or your risk of certain things? And so what they did is they looked at the data from the Framingham Heart Study, and we already know that same way that there's a polygenic risk score for dementia, there's a polygenic risk score for cardiovascular disease and for all-cause mortality. So we know, you can look at different parts of people's genome and say, oh, you're higher risk of this or you're higher risk of that. So what they looked at for the Framingham Heart Study people is they looked at what were their life's essential 8 scores, looking at those things I just showed you before, how did they score, and it's a score up to 100, basically. And they also looked at their DNA methylation profiles to see what was their epigenetic risk for cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality and things like that. And they put it together. Now, not surprisingly, too far, a higher Life Essential 8 score meant that you had a lower risk of heart disease and all-cause mortality. That's not surprising, right? Like, you're doing all these good things, you are likely to have less risk of a heart attack or to die. But what was interesting is when they looked at the DNA methylation and they said, what's going on with the epigenetics and the risk? People who had a higher Life Essential 8 score, even if they had a high genetic predisposition to heart disease or to early premature mortality, that the higher your score was on that Life's Essential 8, the lower your risk was, and it was most pronounced for the people who were at high risk genetically. So exactly the same thing that we saw in the dementia study, basically, is that it's great if you're dealt a good hand and maybe you're at low risk for heart disease. You're still going to do better if you have all these, Life's Essential 8 lifestyle habits, definitely. But for the people who need it the most are the people that are at high genetic risk, and they get the most benefit with lifestyle change. So again, too far. Genetics loads the gun, but it's lifestyle that pulls the trigger. So don't feel like your DNA is your destiny and you have no choices in the matter. Yes, we all get handed a certain deck of cards or a certain hand, but we can make a huge difference, and that's what some of these studies are showing based on what our lifestyle choices are. So when we think about our journey, our future, like what we want to be, realize that epigenetics proves that we've got some responsibility for the outcome. It's not written in our genes. It has a lot to do with what we choose on a daily basis, what we eat, who we hang out with, how much we sleep, all that stuff. I mean, actually, Eric Adams said it very well, the mayor of New York, who said, we've learned that it's not my DNA, it's my dinner. And it's not my lineage, it's my lunch. And it's not where I was born, it's my breakfast. Now, I would add to that, there's a physical activity piece and a whole bunch of other things, but we do not have to accept lives that are filled with chronic disease, shortened, all those things, just because that runs in our family. We actually have a choice and a chance to make it a different option. And that's why I like this one, which says, it is never too late to be what you might have been. So it does not matter. You can be 80, and it can make a difference if you make a change. Now, I would love for all of us to start as early as possible, so don't hang out and wait till you're 80, but it's never too late. You saw how fast epigenetic changes happen in our DNA, or the proteins around our DNA, and how our DNA is expressed. It can happen in a week. It can definitely happen in a couple months. So whenever start, make small steps, and move in that direction. So don't gamble with your health and longevity. Use that epigenetic toolkit that we're talking about and that all of our wonderful presenters are going to talk about more today, because then you can play your cards like a centenarian. And that would be to eat a predominantly whole food plant-based diet, to enjoy frequent physical activity, to prioritize restorative sleep. That's one of the big ones for me too. And to nurture your social connections. Engage in healthy stress management strategies, avoid tobacco and excessive alcohol, and in the end, honor your ikigai. That's how you play your cards like a centenarian. And that's that. We are finished with my part. So let me see how many minutes we have. I don't know if we've got time for a question and answer.